Today I'm going to save some white wisteria seeds, and then I'm going to seed start some white wisteria seeds, and I'm going to show you guys how I do it. Now, before you do this, I just want you to know that it's not practical to start wisteria from seed because it could take up to 20 years before you ever get any blooms from that plant. It's much better to take cuttings and propagate it that way. And that's how I got this plant. I took a cutting from a plant that was decades old near our property, and I planted it here 3 years ago, and you can see how thick the trunk is already. And it's doing really well. It bloomed in its second year, and the cutting was probably about 12 inches long and about a little, not as thick as a pencil. So this is what the seed pods look like, and you want to harvest them in early spring, late winter, as soon as you start to see the skin of the pod crackling like this. And they're really easy to open. They seem like they're really hard to open because the pods are actually really woody and hard. But if you just give them a little bit of a twist or try to break them in half, it'll start to crack, and then it kind of busts open on its own. So it's kind of neat. So this is what the seeds look like. And the seeds have a really hard coating, so you can nick them or file them down a little bit in order to get them to germinate faster, but they could take up to 30 days to germinate. Sometimes they'll germinate within 10 days. It just depends on the seed and how developed the seed coat is. Before you ever start to grow wisteria, there's some really important things to know is almost all wisteria varieties are invasive. There are some varieties that are sterile, meaning they won't produce viable seed, which is a good thing, but they'll still shoot up roots, or I'm sorry, shoots from their roots. So I maintain my wisteria in such a way that I don't get any shoots, and I don't get too much spreading. And the way that I do that is I prune them twice a year, in the spring, early spring, after they've bloomed, and in the late summer. And I just maintain a certain size. But one thing you really, really need to know that I feel like nobody mentions is that you don't want to over prune your wisteria, or that can cause it to shoot off a bunch of side shoots and suckers. So what I do is when I'm first starting to grow from a small plant, I let it grow to the size that I want it to be, and then I always prune it to keep it at that size. I don't let it get overgrown and then end up pruning a ton of it off, because if you end up doing a huge prune job on the wisteria, again, that's how you're going to get a bunch of those shoots coming up from the roots. It triggers the plant to try to survive and shoot up new plants. So a good rule of thumb is never prune more than a third of your plant if you don't want those shoots to come up from the roots. But if you could do less than that and just keep it maintained to the size that you want, that's even better. So here I just nicked the very edge of a seed, and I made sure not to nick where the eye of the seed is, because that's where the root is going to come out. But this nicking the edge of the seed is just going to help it to germinate faster, but you don't really have to do that. If you look back at my earlier clips, you'll notice that my wisteria is kind of pulling up the roof on my chicken barn. I end up having to prune that every year. That's how fast wisteria grows. I do it twice a year. I end up having to prune it away from there, and then I reattach the roof. This year, I'm going to actually put some stakes in and try to pull the plant away from that building because I want it to grow on an arbor. I'm using some coconut coir, again, to seed start in, and I'm only going to fill my pot about halfway. And the reason I'm doing that is because once the sprout comes up and it gets to about 6 inches tall, I'm going to pile in some compost, and that's going to cause that stem to root some more, and then I'll get a better established plant before I transfer it into a bigger pot. Again, I'm just doing this for fun. This really isn't a practical way to propagate your wisteria plant. Then you're just going to want to keep the soil really moist for the first 10 days, and then after that you can let it dry slightly, but you always want to keep it fairly wet until it sprouts. And like I said, it could take up to 30 days, but usually they sprout pretty quickly within 10 days, especially if it's really warm. I love wisteria. I think it's so beautiful, and I'm usually not an invasive plant lover, but the white wisteria smells so good. It's almost like a gardenia sort of scent, but I just love it. It tends to be peachy pink sometimes, and this one actually is already blooming twice a year. So it blooms in the spring through summer sporadically, and then in late summer, fall, it'll bloom again. Thank you guys so much for watching. We'll see you next time.